Hi, my name is Evelyn Shih. I'm an assistant professor of Chinese here at CU Boulder, and I'm here to introduce the movie CROSSCURRENT. So, CROSSCURRENTs is an interesting translation, but the Chinese title for this film is actually Changjiangtu, which is a map of the Yangtze River, right? It sounds a little bit less poetic, perhaps, but in fact what it evokes, as you'll see very soon, is an old, perhaps hand-drawn map of this very distinctive river in China. So it is a map of China, in fact, not just a map of the river. And in creating a map, what it wants to evoke is something like an old landscape painting, right? An old landscape painting that perhaps is painted on a very long scroll and allows the viewer to pass time by walking past it and viewing it slowly. In Chinese landscape painting, you'll often have inscriptions of poetry written on top of the painted landscape. And the film actually evokes this as well by inscribing poetry in many different scenes of the film. And you'll see that it doesn't actually quite make sense in terms of a film narrative. It's not really heavy on the plot. What it really is just vignettes that are tied together by a certain poetic sentiment. There is a lyrical feeling of longing for a person that is constantly disappearing and longing for, let's say, these landscapes that have a long history in Chinese landscape painting and in the Chinese imagination, but very few people actually get to see in real life. So there are two historical touch points that I think might help you understand this film. The first is that this film came out after the completion of the Three Gorges Dam. Right? This is a great infrastructural project that has been talked about since I think maybe late 19th, early 20th century, and it didn't come into reality until it began to be built in the 1990s and then was finished in the 2010s. Right? So this movie came out right after, a few years after the dam was completed. It was considered to be a great triumph of national building and construction, and it really is supposed to have tamed the river. But what it also did is it filled up this very famous stretch of the Yangtze River so that the kind of very, very high mountains and gorges became a little less high and a little less astounding, right? And also what it did was displace millions of people off the banks as the banks were flooded. Now, this shows up in the film at one point, and you'll see when the main character actually goes through the dam, right? So he's on a boat, and you'll see it in great detail that it pauses, the film slows down, and everything changes after he moves through this pass. And so it marks this sort of momentous change in China as the dam has come to fruition. So the second historical touch point is perhaps a little bit more difficult to explain, but the poems that were written for this film are supposedly linked to the post-Tiananmen 1989 moment when a lot of poets are writing in what is called a misty mode of poetry, in which it was very difficult to write about anything directly because, of course, censorship closed down after that terrible incident, and a lot of democratic uprisings were kind of clamped down very quickly. And so if you had a sort of trauma from that national moment of 1989, June 4th, you had to kind of write about it poetically in a way that obscured its true meaning. And this generated a lot of poetry that didn't seem to have a direct object. It was very difficult to interpret or understand. But what it was really about is just that emotional and lyrical processing of a trauma that cannot be talked about in public. And so I think in the choosing of the tone for the poems, and I think the director may have written most of them himself, in addition to quoting some other ones, he wanted to really capture that moment, that mistiness, that really transcendent and hard to grasp quality of poetry. And so if you're trying to understand the poetic meanings of the film, keep in mind that it's trying to be misty and it's trying to be on this sort of plane of obfuscation that is self-protective, but also became its own movement in poetry in China during the 1990s. And so with that, I hope you enjoy this movie. It is absolutely gorgeous and an experience.